Hello vinyl community and hello music lovers. When you think about psychedelic music from the late 60s, you often think about like Pink Floyd or the Beatles or bands like that recorded new sounds, new psychedelic sounds with a lot of studio trickery, and they were using the studio as an instrument to create this wonderful psychedelic pop and psychedelic rock music. But at the same time, there was some wonderful and weird and innovative music being created in the folk scene. So in this video, I'm going to talk about acid folk or psychedelic folk, and I'm going to talk about psychedelic folk from Britain only. American folk rock is a different thing compared to British folk music, so they're kind of separate, and I should probably do another video about it, but I want to more focus about British psychedelic folk music. When you talk about British acid folk, there's one band that you just have to mention. They were kind of the starting point of everything. And I'm talking about Incredible String Band. Incredible String Band, they were this new, young folk band from Scotland, and they released one album in 1966, their debut album, and it was this record, self-titled, and at this point they were a trio with Robin Williamson, Clive Palmer and Mike Heron, and this record is not part of this acid folk video, but I just want to show you this record because it's important in the story. They were recorded and produced by the American producer Joe Boyd, and he's also a really important figure in this psychedelic folk movement in England. He produced this as a new folk band. They were playing at the folk clubs at the time and were kind of the new young sounds of folk at that time. But after this was recorded, all three of them, like real hippies, they went out to travel. They went to India, to Afghanistan, to North Africa, and they traveled like separately, so they didn't go together. And from those trips, they brought back a lot of instruments and a lot of ideas about music and about Eastern music and other types of non-Western music. And when they finally got back to England with all these instruments and ideas, Clive Palmer, this guy, he hadn't returned. So the other two, they decided to continue Incredible String Band without him. And at that time, they had all these instruments and all these ideas, and they wanted to create new wonderful music with all these new sounds that they had collected on their travels. And Joe Boyd, the producer, he really thought that this was something extra. And he also thought that this type of music could really attract the hippies and the counterculture in London. Because Joe Boyd, he was also a key figure in the psychedelic movement. He had produced Pink Floyd's debut single, Arnold Lane. He had the UFO club in London where all these psychedelic bands were playing. So he thought that, yeah, I can bring in this folk band into this psychedelic scene. So he booked Incredible String Band to the UFO club, and the hippies really liked what they heard. And there were other folk bands coming into that scene, like Tyrannosaurus Rex with Mark Bolan was another kind of band that were playing in those clubs. But Joe Boyd and Incredible String Band went into the studio to record their first psychedelic folk LP. And it was actually Joe Boyd that thought that we should brand this as a psychedelic record. So they went into the studio and recorded their second album that is called 5,000 Spirits or the Layers of the Onion in this wonderful psychedelic album artwork. They were, of course, experimenting with LSD, and they were into this whole psychedelic culture at the time. But here we have them, Robin Williamson and Mike Heron. And this album cover was designed by the Dutch art collective called The Fool, who did a lot of the graphics for the whole British counterculture, the psychedelic scenes. I mean, they painted John Lennon's Rolls Royce in all these psychedelic colors, and they did a lot of stuff, a lot of album covers. So this LP came out and became a huge success. All the hippies loved it, and they were playing regularly at the UFO club and the psychedelic clubs in Britain. So this was really the starting point for psychedelic folk in Britain. And it was released on Elektra in the UK. This is a stereo copy. Here they have all these instruments that they brought back from their travels. And I mean, they couldn't really play those instruments, but they were like great musicians, so they could figure out how to play things with them. Music without technique or something, like they played it the way that they could figure it out, and they created some really weird and wonderful psych music with trippy, spacey, mysterious lyrics. But it's a great LP, and it's the start for the whole psychedelic folk movement in Britain.
My Friday evening's footsteps plodding dully through this black town are far away now from the world that I'm in. My eyes are listening to some sounds that I think just might be springtime. With daffodils between my toes, I'm laughing at the wind. And so
one of all those bands that were influenced by Incredible String Band was a band from Ireland called Dr. Strangely Strange. And they released an album in 1969 called Keep of the Serenes, with this lovely psyche cover. They are like sitting out next to a river or a lake or something with these masks and playing flutes and bongo drums and like real hippies. And they were heavily influenced by Incredible String Band. In fact, it was actually Incredible String Band that secured them a record deal, because for some reason Incredible String Band went to Dublin and met up with these guys, and they heard them and they liked what they heard. So they suggested Dr. Strangely Strange to the producer Joe Boyd, and he went over there and listened to them, and he liked them enough to wanted to record them, and they recorded this album. Lovely artwork here on the back. So they were signed to Joe Boyd, and he secured a deal with them on Island Records. It was released on these Pink Island labels. So this was a trio. On the cover here there are 4 people, but this girl here, she wasn't in the bands. Actually, she was living in this commune that they had. They lived in like a hippie house in Dublin that they were calling the orphanage, where all the hippies hung out, and they did a lot of acid and they played music. And so this band was basically 2 guitars, a flute. They had a harmonium as well, and just like Incredible String Band, they brought in some other instruments that they found on markets and stuff, and they couldn't really play them as well, but in the same spirit as Incredible String Band, they used a lot of instruments and put them down. And this is a truly psychedelic folk LP. It has some really great songs with flutes, and they are trippy and they are mysterious and everything that you want from an acid folk LP.
I would gather shells for weaving magic spells to bind thee to me, blindly woo thee. La, 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 dark-eyed lady.
Now I want to go back to the original lineup of Incredible String Band and talk a little bit about Clive Palmer. the guy that didn't return from the trips down to India and Afghanistan when the others did. And when he got back from his travels, he found out that the Incredible String Band had moved on without him and released the 5000 Spirit album, and they had become a really big success in the hippie and the psych scene. So he was kind of lost there for a couple of years. He was a great banjo player, so he recorded a banjo LP, and I'm not sure if it was ever released, but he played in different bands, and eventually he moved out to Cornwall in England, where he formed the band C.O.B, that stands for Clive's Original Band. And they were a bunch of hippies that were living on air and like playing folk music. And they were good friends with Ralph McTell, another UK folkie who had a big hit or so. He was like a big name. And he kind of secured a deal for them to record a couple of albums. And I'm going to show their second and last LP with this wonderful cover. This is C.O.B with the album Moyshe, McStiff and the Tartan Lancers of the Sacred Heart. Very weird title, but a really cool fantasy kind of cover. This knight is riding on a dragon or slaying a dragon, I'm not really sure. Slaying a dragon. And it's a lovely textured gatefold. You can fold out like this. With this beautiful inside here with flowers and stuff. And here you can see the band with Clive Palmer. To me, this LP is a little bit more darker than Incredible String Band. It's more spiritual maybe, and they are singing about Christianity and spiritual things. And really well played, well produced, and really, really great trippy songs. And I think it's a highlight of all the British acid folk LPs. This came out in 1972 on Polydor's Folk Mill label. Looks like this. And this LP is pretty rare and very hard to find. And like many of these covers, they are very fragile, and this is like matte textured paper, so it's easily bruised, as you can see here on the spine. But it has a lot of great songs, and I think it's a wonderful LP. So this is Clive's Original Band, or C.O.B, with the Moyshe, McStiff and the Tartan Lancers of the Sacred Heart. What a title.
I love the willow tree who spreads her branches down toward the river, changing with the many seasons. Dawn will
Another folk duo that was playing in all the psychedelic clubs in London were Tyrannosaurus Rex. And this is their second album with a nice title, Prophet, Seers and Sage and the Angels of the Ages. All these titles, I mean. But here we can see, of course, the little hobbit, Mark Bolan, and Peregrine Took on percussion there, looking really cool. And this was released in this very, very like textured, you can see, textured cover, flip back, British style. I just love UK flip back covers with textures and everything. And this came out on Regal Zonophone. This is from 1968. So they were playing in all the psychedelic clubs, and they were just a duo. Mark Bolan on guitar and singing, with Peregrine Took on banging out his percussions. And they were totally into elves and fantasy and weird songs about psychedelic fantasy worlds that they were creating with Mark Bolan's kind of weird lyrics that no one could really understand. But they did some really great music, and this is of course before Mark Bolan went electric and became this electric warrior, you know, with all his glam rock things that he did later on. But at this point he was a little hippie, playing his guitar in these psychedelic clubs in London. And I mean, he didn't come from a folk scene or anything, he came from a pop scene. He was, before this, playing in John's Children. It was like a freak beat band. And he had released a few solo singles, more pop singles. But he went acoustic, he went psychedelic and went folk in '67. And he released a couple of albums under the name Tyrannosaurus Rex that are really great. And his singing voice is so characteristic, you can hear it from miles away when it's Mark Bolan with his kind of special vibrato thing, I don't know. But another example of great acid folk from the UK with Tyrannosaurus Rex.
Harlequinesque, hair-plaited heather, stepping so lightly, it's bright in the house of my side. Oh my dear, traveling tradition, it's sky clear, you're a gift from the fair folk.
The next LP I'm gonna show is by a band called Jan Dukes de Grey, and it's their debut album called Sorcerers that came out in this wonderful album cover. This was released on the Decca Nova label by two guys, these two guys. So this LP feels almost like a ritual that is caught on tape. It's often very short songs with just some acoustic guitars and hand drums and a lot of flute work that gives it this trippy vibe. It feels a little bit like the songs aren't finished and they are more like sketches or fragments of songs. So there's a lot of songs on this LP. I think it's 11 songs on side 1 and 7 songs on side B. The labels looks like this. This is the blue Decca Nova stereo copy. These old records were released with this stereo mono hole punched in the back of the cover. So if you had the blue, it was the stereo, and if you had the red, this is like the inner sleeve. If it was red, it was mono, and if it was this blue, it was stereo. So you could like see in the store if you got a stereo or a mono copy. Blue stereo, red mono. This band later on went more electric and did a more like progressive album with their second one. I prefer this first one where they were more like, a bit like Tyrannosaurus Rex with Mark Bolan, that type of psychedelic folk with bongos and flutes and great trippy album in this lovely album artwork as well.
From a high price room, I survey the town. I wear my mind upside down. From the road.
The last LP I'm gonna show is an acid folk album by this duo called The Sun Also Rises that was released on the Village Thing label. It was, let me see here, Graham and Anne Hemingway. So they were actually called Hemingway and they did Sun Also Rises. It's pretty interesting. They looked like this, like a hippie couple. And this LP is very influenced by Incredible String Band. Sounds pretty much like them, but with these male vocals that do really great harmonies together. And he was a really good guitar player, this guy. And this is both like whimsical songs and like more mysterious, haunting songs, and has some kind of homegrown psych qualities to it. But a great listen if you're into the incredible string band sounds and if you dig British acid folk. Maybe not the album you should start with if you're gonna dig into this whole scene, but a great example of acid folk inspired by incredible string band. They were from Cardiff in Wales. It came with an insert, lyrics and stuff. The Village Thing label. And the Village Thing was a small label. They released a couple of interesting LPs, mainly folk and blues LPs. And the guy behind that label is called Ian A. Anderson. I have shown a couple of records, at least one record from him in my previous videos. But he also did some acid folk back in the days. And then later on he became more this like blues folk kind of singer-songwriter. So, pretty interesting acid folk album, very influenced by incredible string band.
What is this that I can see with icy hands taking hold of me?
I am deaf and can excel. I'll open the doors to heaven or hell.
So these are a few examples of acid folk from Britain that I wanted to show from my collection. And I should say that this type of folk music is something that I have been collecting for a really long time. Not only these types of acoustic acid folk bands that I have shown today, but more electric folk rock and progressive folk rock, or, you know, I love all of that. But to me, folk is walking on a very thin line between amazing and bad. So it's easy to trip to one side or trip to the other side. But when you trip to the amazing side, the music is fantastic. There are so many folk records that I think are just like, yeah, it's just traditional folk. And that is maybe not for me. I know that the fat bearded man, Headley, he think otherwise. He loves all his folk. But to me, I need it to be coming from the counterculture or from the hippies or the psychedelic side or the progressive side of folk. But anyway, that's just me. So I was thinking about doing a couple of more videos about British folk. I'm gonna do one about electric folk rock. I'm gonna do one about progressive folk. And I'm gonna do something about, a few more about singer-songwriters or female singer-songwriters and stuff like that. There are so many cool records to show and so much great music to explore. So hit the subscribe if you want to and join me on those videos. Now it's time for you to put down a comment and a like if you want that, and let me know what you thought about this video, or if you have suggestions for acid folk records that you think are extraordinary that you want to recommend. Put them down in the comments, or just put down a comment and say hi. Anyway, thanks for tuning in, and thanks for dropping out with me today on this acid folk episode. Peace out.